Well, a victory for opponents of the NDAA. A federal judge has ruled that provisions in the controversial law may violate our constitutional rights. President Obama signed the National Defense Authorization Act back in December. The move has outraged activists that say the law is so vague it allows U.S. citizens to be indefinitely detained by the military without due process. But a group of activists sued President Obama, and yesterday the federal judge took their side. Here is part of the court order issued by Judge Katherine Forrest. It reads, quote, "This court is acutely aware that preliminarily enjoining an act of Congress must be done with great caution. However, it is the responsibility of our judicial system to protect the public from acts of Congress which infringe upon constitutional rights." So the law has been blocked, at least for now. Let's talk more about the case and the implications of it. David Seaman, journalist and host of the DL Show, joins us now. Hi, David. So I know that you are a very big critic of the NDAA, so a huge victory for you. Your reaction to the judge's ruling?
Well, there are a lot of people who have been watching this NDAA case over the past few months, and they're basically saying that her decision is amazing. It's extraordinary. It's a huge victory. And while those things are true, she's just doing her job. This is something that any federal judge in her position should have decided. It's not as if she's doing something that's out of the usual. It's just that we haven't seen the system work in so long that I think people were surprised to see, checks and balances actually work. This is actually being checked. It's actually being stopped. And there's still work to be done. There's an amendment in Congress being discussed today. But this is definitely good news. And it gives great legitimacy to those people out there who said that the NDAA is a major threat to American citizens' basic civil rights.
That's right. I know that there were a lot of skeptics that this lawsuit, Hedges versus President Obama, that this would actually go anywhere, but and are happy and surprised, just as you are, to see this victory. The court said provisions of the bill could be unconstitutional. Talk about what constitutional rights you say this law violates.
Well, this is something that you don't need to be a federal judge to understand. If you've been through a 7th or 8th grade civics course, you understand the basics of the Bill of Rights. And potentially the NDAA's indefinite detention provisions violate your First Amendment and Fifth Amendment rights. With the First Amendment, the problem is there's a possible chilling effect. Are you going to write something saying, the war in Afghanistan is a bad idea? Are you going to write something supportive of Anonymous or supportive of peaceful protesters like Occupy Wall Street, if that can be interpreted as material support to an enemy of the United States, and if you can be imprisoned without trial, without charges, potentially for years, and with no proper court involvement? If that's the case, a lot of reporters are going to say, hey, I'm not going to cover this. I'm just going to do my job and go home. I don't want to end up in prison. I don't want my family members ending up in prison. And you see in oppressive regimes like in North Korea, they use laws like this, and the result is that nobody speaks out. So obviously we're nowhere near that point. But for several months, for 4.5 months in the U.S., we were living under NDAA. Until yesterday, it was a possibility that if you did something the government really didn't like, or you said something that really harmed their interests, even if it's not violent and not actually a threat to anybody's physical safety, that they could imprison you without a trial. And that's scary. That's not what America is all about.
It certainly sounds horrifying. And what makes the NDAA so controversial is how vague it is. Its vagueness, critics say, open up all kinds of scary possibilities. And we did have a chance to speak to one of the plaintiffs in this case, Chris Hedges, on the show not too long ago. Here's what he had to say about this.
It removes due process for anybody who is deemed not just a terrorist, but to have contact with these associated forces. That's not a term that's defined. It's nebulous. It's quite a frightening piece of legislation.
So plaintiffs and critics, as you mentioned earlier, fear that even reporting on terrorists could be considered grounds for being detained under this law. And the judge did acknowledge the danger of some of the language in this bill. Can you talk about some of the dangers associated with the language being so vague?
Well, we've seen time and time again that when you have legislation that is too vague, it's abused. And we saw that with the Patriot Act. That's still ongoing. The Patriot Act originally was only to be used for pursuing terrorists. And instead, it's been used on thousands of tax evasion cases and cases that have drug dealing cases, things that have nothing to do with terrorism. When you give government huge new powers, they tend to take those powers. I agree with Chris Hedges, and specifically somebody in his position. I mean, he was a war correspondent, and he's covering people who are straight up potentially enemies of the U.S. So just by contacting those people, just by writing about them in a newspaper, he's subjecting himself to indefinite detention. And if you just look at those two words, indefinite detention, it makes no sense. What's also so offensive about this is that it was snuck into our annual defense bill. The NDAA is passed every year. It funds hundreds of billions of dollars of military expenses and keeps our troops paid, and they snuck this in there. If they wanted to pass something this draconian and weird, it should have been called the Imprisonment Without Trial of American Citizens Act. If it was called that, I do not think it would have gotten this far. I do not think Obama would have signed it into law.
I don't think they would sign a law with a title like that. This sounds a little bit less harmful, I guess. But the judge has put a preliminary injunction in place. This is a measure that is only temporary. So how do you hope this plays out, and are you confident that it will prevail?
I'm not 100% confident, but at this point, there has been major interest in Congress to amend the NDAA's indefinite detention provisions. That's what they're working on today. Representative Amash and several others are working on legislation that would fix this. And even after it's fixed, we do need to investigate this. Who was behind it? Where did the money come from? Where did the lobbying push come from? Why did we need this? Is there some threat that we don't know about? And even so, what threat could be so great that you can revoke the Bill of Rights, that you can revoke basic civil rights for American citizens? It must be a pretty big deal, or it's just an illegal, unconstitutional power grab. Either way, we need to know what happened and what the motivation here was.
And lastly, David, at what point would you say that justice has been served? Do you want to see the NDAA gone away with completely?
Well, you can't do away with the NDAA because it has a lot of legitimate and necessary provisions. This is a bill that is hundreds of pages long and funds our military operations. I want to see indefinite detention done away with. I want to see an act passed that would prevent this from ever happening again. Just a simple act saying that no bill in Congress can ever infringe upon your Bill of Rights, period. No loopholes, no nonsense. You just can't do it. And that's what I'd like to see. And then I'd like to see those held accountable. I mean, if you're responsible for this, you should be held accountable. And that includes, I believe, Carl Levin, a Democrat, and John McCain, a Republican. They were the ones who drafted this provision, as far as I know. And we should get answers from them. Why did they draft this? Why did they feel it's necessary?
All right, David. Pleasure to have you on the show. As always, that was David Seaman, journalist and host of the DL Show.